Season 2 of Love, Transform, Evolve is brought to you by Dreams Financial. When I was looking for a new financial advisor, Alex and Steph were the obvious choice. They didn't just see me as a client, but rather as a partner in building and protecting my wealth. Their personalized approach and innovative solutions have made financial planning a breeze, not to mention the fact that they are in it with me, explaining everything as we go so that I always know where my money is going and why. And when it comes to the death of a loved one, Alex and Steph are experts at providing compassionate guidance, offering clarity and direction. For more information, visit their website at dreamsfinancial.ca. New name, new look, same me. I'm Cynthia Iorio, and this is Love, Transform, Evolve. Season 1 of this podcast pulled back the curtain on caregiving, offering unique and heartfelt insight into what is often an underrepresented segment of our society. Season 2 is all about transformation and will feature interviews with experts, caregivers, and regular people just like you.
So caregiving for us, we would consider it a sacred responsibility.
When a person has a burnout, it doesn't happen just overnight.
That's not working. This isn't working. That person said this. It didn't do that. I mean, the list goes on and on.
What we do know about loneliness is that it's more fatal than obesity and alcoholism put together.
That is probably one of the most vexing things that caregivers deal with.
That's it. That is everything. Like every question you ask me, the answer's there.
Lead with Love was season 1, and it was a beautiful exploration of my experience in the caregiving space. It was an opportunity for me to share so much of what was in my mind about what I had going on and to share and connect with others to help me make sense of what it was that I was going through. But we're going to shift gears a little bit in this season. Love, Transform, Evolve really is the next step in this conversation. It's less about my personal experience and it's more about the collective, intimate experience that we all have together. Think of this as conversations with caregivers, a round table, if you would, of us sharing our ideas of what we're going through, our collective triumphs and our collective challenges, and really opening up again more and more the dialogue of what it is to be a caregiver. Now, we're not going to capture it all. We can't paint caregiving and caregivers with one brush stroke of a paintbrush. It's not possible. And so we're going to try to highlight the similarities, but we're also going to call out some of those differences because it is in the differences in our experiences that allows us to open up empathy and compassion, and also to reframe the perspective we have on our own experiences. The more I speak with people, the more I realize that there is still this really heavy stigma around what it means to be a caregiver. And I'm curious. I want to know, and this is what we're doing in this series. I'm curious about what it is, why there is this stigma. I am struggling with why people don't identify with this. Is it a PR problem? Is it that the images themselves of caregivers aren't comprehensive? Is it an ego problem that we don't want to admit that we are doing things like wiping people's butts or, as I said in Lead with Love, being on the phone for 4 hours chasing a doctor? Is it that we don't want to admit that we have those things to do? Is it the way we talk about caregiving itself and we don't value it itself because we think that there is weakness in vulnerability or that they are softer tasks? I want to know what that is because I don't believe that caregiving itself is something for the lighthearted. And I think it's a beautiful and powerful experience. And I want to transform the way we think about it because it transforms us. It's such a unique role and hat that we wear when we are caregivers. There are things that caregivers do that are tactical, that are really hands-on in the weeds. If I think about as a job, individual contributor, right? There are things that I could be doing as a caregiver that requires me to have a physical hands-on approach, but there's also a much larger thing going on, which is a mental burden, a mental responsibility, a mental exercise, strategizing, foreshadowing, planning. There is a lot more that goes into caregiving. And all of this makes the person who takes on this role a jack of all trades. And it's important that we talk about all aspects of caregiving. It's important that we include more voices, more faces in the conversation around caregiving, so that as we expand our knowledge and our experience around this role, we can see ourselves in each other. Brian Sutherland is a product manager who's a caregiver for both of his parents. I had the pleasure of connecting with Brian over several occasions, and we've always had insightful conversations. In my interview with him, we explored what it meant for him to be a caregiver and what he thought his caregiving responsibilities were. You know, when we think about caregivers, we often think about women in that role. There's often a huge representation of women. We think about, that being a natural woman's nurturing. How did you, what has your experience been being a man in this space?
Oh, I mean, I'm going to kind of lean back on my prior answer, right? It didn't really feel like caregiving really at all. I would say it's a little bit of like, I would say one part nurturing in a sense, but it felt more like as a man, I kind of felt more like it was like almost like my responsibility in a sense, and thinking about things in a particular way of hey, like bringing in enough income to make sure that we had food on the table, that we had a roof over our heads, and at times, I would say, to your point, women tend to be on the more nurturing side than men. We tend to be a little bit more gruff and a little bit more like, hey, almost kind of like punching to the point on certain things. And so that sometimes would come across it a little bit rougher, especially with trying to help someone who is really going through a lot. Like when you think about it, a lot of physical challenges, a lot of the emotional challenges that came with like losing the ability to do things or enjoy things that person was so accustomed to. So I would say that for me, at least, it turned into opportunities to actually grow and become a more nurturing individual, and not be as heavy-handed or as hard about certain things.
I was at the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence Summit last year, and there was a panel that was done just about men in the caregiving space. And one of the things that they said, which is what you echoed, is that, a man's propensity is to think about providing and caring for their loved one in those tangible, more kind of linear ways, if you would. And that actually should not be discredited and discounted. And in the space of talking about caregiving, it's important, especially if for, advocacy and moving policy forward and moving different supports forward for caregivers, it's important we expand the definition of what it means to offer care. For people to identify with those roles and be able to go ask for help, for example.
Yeah. And it's honestly, to that end, right, it can feel like a very lonely journey. And so calling that out, it's almost in the same vein of mental wellness, right? You can't consider yourself healthy if you just care for the physical. You have to balance out, your physical health, your spiritual health, and your mental health. And so one of the things that at least I dealt with was balancing that out, not losing who I am because I felt this tremendous weight and responsibility to care for this other individual, and still balancing taking care of that person, but at the same time creating the necessary boundaries that where I can maintain my individuality while I went through that journey.
Absolutely. So you mentioned something a couple of minutes ago about caregiving being the opportunity for you to explore and discover and develop parts of you that were otherwise untapped. We're shifting this season from the title of the podcast from as being Lead with Love to Love, Transform, Evolve. And transformation through this journey of caring for a loved one is something that happens to many of us in this space. So what was that like for you? Can you talk to me a little bit more what that was like to
Oh my God. I mean, I would call it at the time, like going through it in real time. I would just call it as, the classic bickering, arguing, right? Like, it doesn't feel like that's what's going on. For me, at least, I found it at least, in the transform part, anytime I was bickering and arguing, right, it was always coming from a well-intentioned and a a good wishes point of view that, hey, I'm looking out for, in this case, my mother, making sure that she isn't making whatever might be going on worse. But that is also dealing with, at the same time, caring about that person's feelings and emotions at the moment, not just sticking with the hard facts. And so it isn't until after the fact where I had a chance to actually reflect backward and look at, all right, well, for what went on, what could have been maybe looked upon differently. It also empowered me to be able to ask the questions and say, hey, I really want to understand your point of view more. And something that, quite honestly, especially in my mid-20s, that's not something I thought of in my mid-20s. That's not something that I even really thought of even in my early 30s. It's something that carries with me. And actually, it actually helped to form an incredible bond with my wife and to be able to have a really strong relationship with her, and carries forward into how I conduct myself with my children and just everything in my life.
Brian touched on transformation and his transformation not actually feeling like progress in the moment. And that is what transformation can feel like. It's not like when you're going through this emancipating moment, do we actually realize that the struggle, this slog that we're going through feels like progress. It can feel heavy and it can feel daunting. And oftentimes it is only in hindsight that we have the ability to reflect and look back on how the hard things that we've been to in our lives have changed us. It really is the matter or the difference between perception and perspective. When we perceive a lot of things, when we're in the weeds of caring for somebody, we are bound by our perception of how things are happening, and we can get caught up in the story. And if we have the opportunity to maybe take a little bit of a step back to lean on perspective as to what's actually happening, it could actually shift the impact of doing caregiving has on us, and it also shifts the way we see ourselves in this role. I always say that caregiving has been my superpower. It is my superpower. And again, it didn't always feel like that in the moment, but after the fact, looking back, having the awesome, amazing responsibility of caring for my parents who cared for me and raised me, but now in their time of need, was something that I took to heart and I definitely am extremely proud of. When my dad got sick, which was years after my mom did, the thought that I had was, okay, I got this. Nothing else matters right now. This is what we're doing. We're here now in the moment. And we often hear the typical narrative of how hard it is to care for someone else. And there are definitely hardships for sure. But when I hear others who talk about how inspiring their experience was, or how they too see caring for another one as an honor, it It's just an amazing reminder of how incredible we are and the opportunity for transformation in this journey. Grant Bruno is nehiyaw Indigenous and a registered member of Nipsichipak in Alberta. He's also a PhD candidate in pediatric medical sciences at the University of Alberta and the father of 4. I saw him at the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence's summit back in November 2023, and I was inspired by what he had to say and how people in the Indigenous communities actually see caregiving in their world.
So caregiving for us, I would argue that we would consider it a sacred responsibility. And what that means is that for us anyways, there's a spiritual element to everything that we do. Now, through processes of colonization and, things like the Indian Act here within Canada, a lot of these teachings have been lost. And so what I've been doing now is connecting back with elders myself to gather these teachings so that I can teach others. So when I go back to the sacred responsibility, like I'd mentioned, there's a spiritual element to it. And what that means is that for us as nehiyaw people, we consider ourselves people of the 4. And people of the 4 is our spiritual, our emotional, our physical, and our mental. Now, what healthcare does really good today is focus on the physical part. It's getting a little bit better at the mental part, completely ignores the emotional, and it doesn't even mention the spiritual part. And so when I think about caregiving, what I try and do now is I try and touch, or at least make sure that each of those dimensions is being touched on within the caregiving that I'm giving and the caregiving I'm receiving, right? So, for example, with my children, them being on the autism spectrum, there's a lot of stereotypes that they can't do the same things that other children are going to do. And what I try to do is I try and let them experience everything our culture has to offer, our communities have to offer. And I do this by allowing them to participate in ways that they want to participate. But I'm also taking these teachings that I'm doing in my household and I'm bringing them back to the community. For example, we have powwows in our community. So powwows are really big celebrations, right? They're cultural. If you've never been to a powwow, just think of it as like a really, really beautiful celebration, like a festival. So you get, in our community, we have tens of thousands of people show up over the weekend, thousands of dancers, and it becomes very overwhelming for autistic people through their sensory challenges and whatever. And so what I actually did was I took the teachings that I learned from the community and I implemented something called a sensory teepee. So teepees for us would have been our traditional lodging. And you can go Google what a teepee looks like. And what we did was we outfitted it with sensory items. And so what this allowed for was caregivers in my community to come to the powwow without the fear of having to leave, A, because of judgment, there's a lot of stigma still, or the children are getting overwhelmed. And so I'm thinking about caregiving in different ways now, right? I'm trying to bring the culture and what I do now, what I've learned through my research, and I'm trying to implement it into the community so I can support other caregivers as well. And that is a spiritual responsibility I have now that has been given to me by the community that I have to go now and I have to be able to support other caregivers too.
Do you see this as a rite of passage?
I see this as something that is just, it's a necessary and a really beautiful, I think, strength of the community. And when I see caregiving happening in the community, again, I fully believe a large majority of people have done some caregiving, whether it's caregiving for a sibling, caregiving for a cousin, that comes and lives with you. I've had all those different experiences. I grew up in a foster home, not as the foster child, but as the brother to foster children who were being brought into my home because my mom felt like she had a sacred responsibility to take care of the other children in the community. And so my mom, who's a residential school survivor, who was never really given a full childhood, decided that she was going to take other children on to make sure their experiences weren't going to be like hers. So she took that sacred responsibility on as well. And on top of that, what happens very often in the community, again, I think this is a strength, But because of colonialism, because of all of the destructive policies been dealt with, residential schools, Indian hospitals, outlawing ceremonies, all these different things that really took so much away from us, and we're trying to get back. What I see in the community is the Gukums. So these are our grandmothers, and the Gukums are very much, I think, holding our communities together, which is very beautiful, but they need support too.
Caregiving is about giving a quality of life. It's enhancing someone's life. Somebody who is in need, somebody who can't do it on their own. And because of the different systems that we're interacting with, because of family dynamics, because the pace of life that we're living in today is just so fast and we're trying to fit everything in, there's a lot of opportunity, or there's missed opportunity to find joy in the role. And being a caregiver offers the opportunity to tap into our ingenuity and in our resilience. I want to challenge you, if you can, and if you would, I want to challenge you to shift the way you might be thinking about caregiving and caregivers from being a burden to being a badge of honor. Shift from thinking about the role itself as being something that you need to shy away from or hide talking about, to something that you should be screaming and shouting from the rooftops. If I had a vision for what I would want people who are in the caregiving role, either identifying as caregivers or just doing caregiving tasks, I would love to see them standing at the edge of a cliff, shouting from the rooftops that they're caregivers, and inviting other people to see just how incredible they are as human beings and to join in, because caregiving truly is a beautiful, transformative experience. If you like what you heard today, be sure to rate, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes from Season 2 of Love, Transform, Evolve drop every Wednesday morning. I'm Cynthia Iorio. Until next time.